Good evening. Some of the letters that reach this channel are short. This one wasn't. It came from a woman I'll call Ruth. She asked me to change her name, but she wanted every other detail kept exactly as it happened. She's 73 now. For most of her life, she made her living with her hands. She told me she always thought she understood people, because you learn a lot about a person by what they bring you to mend. But the people she couldn't read were her own. What happened to Ruth isn't a story about shouting, or money, or even betrayal, not really. I'm going to tell it the way she wrote it to me. And if any of it sounds familiar, you are not the only one. Let's begin. There are tears you can mend and tears you can't, and Ruth Calloway had spent 50 years learning to tell the difference by touch alone. That morning, the last ordinary morning of her old life, though she didn't know it yet, she sat at the kitchen table in the small house she owned right, a man's torn shirt collar spread under the lamp, and her hands did what they had always done. The needle went in, drew the thread snug, came out. She didn't need to look. Her thumb found the weak place in the weave the way another woman's tongue finds a sore tooth. 50 years of other people's clothes had taught her that fabric remembers everything, where it was strained, where it was patched, where someone had once tried to hide a hole instead of fixing it. You could iron a lie flat. You could not iron it out. She tied off the thread, bit it clean, and held the collar up to the window light, good as before. Better maybe. The new stitching was tighter than the original. Outside, the late winter morning was coming on slow and pale. The kettle ticked as it cooled. On the sill above the sink sat her mother's silver thimble, dented on one side, kept in a chipped teacup the way some people keep a wedding ring. Ruth had buried both her parents, her sister, and her husband. The thimble had outlasted all of them. She had a private, unsentimental thought she'd never said aloud, that she trusted objects more than people, because objects told you the truth about what they'd been through. She was 72. She had been a widow for 10 years, and a woman alone for longer than that, if she was honest. Sam had been kind but distant near the end, the way men of his generation sometimes drifted into the television and didn't come back. After he died, she had not collapsed the way the church ladies expected her to. She had grieved. Then she had painted the kitchen a color he would have hated, cream with a whisper of yellow in it, and planted basil and tomatoes in the side yard, and let the alterations shop in town keep her in just enough work to feel useful. People said, poor Ruth, all alone out there. They had it backwards. She wasn't lonely. She was unaccompanied, which is a different thing entirely, and she had come to like the quiet weight of her own company. So when the phone rang that Tuesday afternoon and it was Daniel, she answered with the small, bright lift in her voice she'd been saving for him since he was 4 years old. Mom, he said, I need you, 3 words. She would turn them over many times in the months to come, looking for the seam where the lie had first gone in. But that afternoon she heard only her son, and her whole body leaned toward the phone. He talked fast, the way he did when he was nervous, which she mistook for the way he did when he was tired. Brooke was burned out. 3 children, no help, the bone-deep exhaustion that wouldn't lift. His work had him traveling, sometimes for a week at a stretch. The real estate market was an animal you had to feed or it ate you. They just needed someone steady in the house, someone the children trusted. Just for a few months, Mom, just until things settled, just until they found the right person, as if she were the wrong one being borrowed in the meantime. She didn't hear it that way then. What about your house? She asked. Where would I? You'd sell yours and come stay with us. We've got the room. Mom, it'd be like when I was a kid, all of us under one roof again. Here is the thing she's asked me to set down honestly because she'd been lying to herself about it for a long time, and she's finished doing that. She did not say yes because she was naive. Ruth Calloway was not a naive woman. She had run a small business, balanced her own books, raised a boy on a seamstress's income when her husband's paycheck ran thin. She knew, somewhere under the warmth of that afternoon, that selling a paid-off house to move into a spare room was a foolish trade. She said yes, because she was hungry to be needed again, and she had not let herself feel that hunger in years. and her own son had just reached into her chest and found it. That is a harder thing to admit than being fooled. Being fooled is something done to you. Wanting too badly to be wanted is something you carry yourself. She did not sell the house in a month. It took most of 2. She got it appraised. She argued with the first buyer's agent over the inspection and won. She sold it in the end for a fair price, $312,000, money Sam's pension and 40 years of careful living had quietly built. And she cried twice during the closing and pretended both times that it was her allergies. What she remembers is not the number. What she remembers is the morning she sold the rocking chair. It was Sam's mother's chair, and it creaked on the third rock, always had, a sound she could have picked out of 1,000 sounds. A young couple bought it for $40 at the porch sale. The girl was pregnant. Ruth watched the husband carry it down the steps and load it into the back of a hatchback, and she had to go inside and run the tap so no one would hear her. Then she dried her hands, came back out, and sold the rest of her life in pieces to strangers, smiling, making change. She kept 3 boxes and 2 suitcases. Inside one box, the photographs, a thimble in its teacup, her mother's recipe book with the cover, gone soft as cloth, and an unfinished quilt. A thing she'd been piecing together for years, blue and gray, a wedding ring pattern with one corner still raw and open, no border, the batting showing through. She had always meant to finish it. There had simply never been a deadline urgent enough. She arrived at Daniel and Brooks on a Friday at the tail end of winter with the suitcases and the 3 boxes and a casserole she'd made, so she wouldn't arrive empty-handed. They were waiting on the front steps, and for one warm minute, it was everything the phone call had promised. The little ones, Theo 8 and Mia 6, came off the porch like puppies let out a gate, shrieking Grandma, and folding themselves against her legs so hard she had to grab the railing. Brooke hugged her, smelling of something expensive and floral, and said, "We are so happy you're here, Ruth. You have no idea." Daniel took the heaviest box from her arms and kissed the top of her head, and for that minute Ruth Calloway believed she had made a wise trade after all. Only Nina hung back. Nina was 16, the oldest, and she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and watched her grandmother, the way Ruth herself watched a garment a customer swore had simply come apart on its own, with a quiet, measuring attention, looking for the place where the story didn't match the seams. When Ruth finally reached her, Nina leaned in for the hug and said, low, just for her, "Hi, Grandma." And there was something in her dark eyes that had no business being in a 16-year-old's face. It was sadness, but it was sadness for Ruth. Pity, almost, as if the girl knew something Ruth didn't and was sorry on her behalf. Ruth filed it away the way she filed a snag in good cloth, come back to that and let herself be pulled inside, into the warmth, into the noise. They showed her the room last. It was at the end of the upstairs hall, past the linen closet, and Ruth understood what it was before Brooke even opened the door, because she had a tailor's eye for proportion, and the door was narrower than the others. It was the room where the Christmas decorations had lived. It still half did. 2 plastic tubs of garland shoved into the closet, the air with that cardboard and attic smell. A twin bed. A small window facing the back alley and the neighbor's fence. The walls were white and bare. There was no place for the rocking chair she no longer had. No place for the framed photographs. No place, she would think later, for almost anything that was actually her. Daniel put his hand on her shoulder. He had Sam's hands, broad and warm, and her own brown eyes. "It's temporary, Mom," he said, "just till we get organized. You know how it is." And Ruth, who had just sold a house with a porch and a garden and a chair that creaked on the third rock, looked at the storage room at the end of the hall and smiled and said, "It's perfect. It's all I need." She believed that too. That was the worst part, looking back. For a little while, she truly believed it. The first week was good. She would hold on to that later, turn it over in her hands like the one undamaged button off a ruined coat. The first week was good, so it wasn't all a lie, was it? She rose before everyone, made coffee in the unfamiliar kitchen, packed 3 lunches with the sandwiches cut into triangles that children always think is magic. She ironed Daniel's shirts and found a small, foolish pleasure in it. Brooke thanked her with her arms full of her own phone, calling over her shoulder, "Honestly, Ruth, I don't know how we survived before you." Theo learned to climb into her lap without asking. Mia brought her drawings. The house was clean when Daniel came home, and dinner was hot, and Ruth felt, for the first time since they'd carried Sam's mother's chair down the steps, like she was part of something that needed her to exist. It was on the 8th night that she noticed the suitcases, two of them standing packed by the front door, one black, one a deep wine red, as if the house were a hotel and someone were always about to check out. She thought nothing of it. People traveled. Her son had an important job. She went to bed in the narrow room at the end of the hall, in the borrowed dark, and listened to the unfamiliar house tick and settle around her. And she did not yet know that downstairs, in a phone left charging on the kitchen counter, there was already a conversation that had been going on for months. A conversation she was the subject of and had never once been part of. She slept well that night. It was, she would tell me later, the last time for a long while that she did. The routine arrived the way water finds the low place in a floor, quietly, and then everywhere at once. By the second week, it had set into the shape it would keep. Ruth woke at 5 before the alarm, before the light. She had set no alarm. Her body simply assumed the duty, as it had once woken her for a colicky infant 40 years before. She would lie still a moment and listen to the furnace breathe, and then she would get up, because there was coffee to make, and 3 lunches to pack, and a household that ran on her hands now, whether or not anyone said so. She packed the lunches at the counter in the blue dark. Sandwiches in triangles, fruit washed and dried, a note in Mia's, sometimes a little drawing of a cat, which Mia never mentioned, but which stopped appearing in the trash after Ruth started doing it, so she kept on. She woke the children at 6:30, dressed the younger 2, found Theo's other shoe, braided Mia's hair while Mia squirmed. Nina dressed herself and came down already wearing the earbuds, a backpack on one shoulder, and ate standing up watching her grandmother over the rim of a glass of orange juice. Then the walk to school, 4 blocks, Theo's hand in her right and Mia's in her left, and Nina drifting ahead. Then the empty house. She cleaned a house that was never finished being clean. She mopped the wide floors Brooke had wanted and never wiped. She folded laundry warm from the dryer, matched the children's socks, put away toys that would be out again by nightfall. At noon, she ate standing at the sink, looking through the window at a backyard nobody used. In the afternoon, she did the walk in reverse and the snack and the homework and the park if the weather held. At night, she cooked dinners that Daniel and Brooke increasingly did not come home to eat, and the suitcases stood by the door, packed, waiting. There were always 2, ready to go. Daniel said it was work, conferences, clients, a market that never slept. Ruth believed him for the same reason she'd believed the phone call, because he was her son, and disbelieving him would have cost more than she was willing to pay. But the hem remembers what the wearer forgets, and Ruth's whole life had trained her to read the small evidence cloth keeps. It started with the suitcases themselves. When they came back, tanned, relaxed, smelling of sun and wine, Ruth unpacked nothing, but she carried the bags upstairs, and her hands knew things her mind hadn't agreed to know yet. The tags, little paper tags looped on the handles, the kind a bellman ties on. She didn't read them on purpose. She just noticed, as she'd notice a crooked seam, that the words on them were not the words of a business trip: spa, resort, oceanfront. A conference does not put you at an oceanfront resort with a spa, not the kind of conference that needs your wife along in a salmon-colored dress. She told herself she was being a foolish old woman. She told herself for 2 weeks, then Brooke asked her to take up a hem. It was a Thursday. Brooke came into the kitchen, holding a linen dress on a hanger mint green, the kind of thing that costs more than Ruth used to make in a week, and she held it out the way you'd hand a dish to the help. "Ruth, you're a lifesaver. Could you just take this up an inch? I've got nothing to wear and we leave Sunday." She said it without looking up from her phone. "We leave Sunday. For the capital," she'd said earlier. "A wellness summit. 3 days." Ruth carried the dress upstairs to the storage room, to the little folding table where she'd set up her machine and turned on the lamp. And that is where the first wall came down, because the dress told her everything. She felt it before she understood it. The way the linen had gone slightly stiff along the bottom, the faint pale crust at the very edge of the hem. She rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger, and there it was, fine as flour. Sand, sea sand, the silty kind, worked up into the weave where a dress drags on a beach at evening, and caught in the inner fold, snagged on a loose thread she trimmed if she'd had this dress in her shop, was a small tag still pinned to the lining, a resort laundry tag, a stub of paper with a sun stamped on it and a name. Not the capital. The dress had been to the ocean. The dress had been somewhere warm and salt and bright, while Ruth packed triangle sandwiches in the blue dark and told the children their parents were working very hard, sweethearts. That's why they're tired when they come home. She sat very still with the dress across her lap. Then she did something she had never done before in her life. She picked up the phone Nina had been teaching her to use, the one Ruth still held at arm's length like it might go off, and she opened the app with the little camera icon, the one Brooke lived inside of, and she typed in Brooke's name. She didn't know what she was looking for. She found it anyway. There were the photographs. Brooke on a white beach in a coral swimsuit and enormous sunglasses. Brooke at a restaurant over the water, a glass of wine lifted, the light gone gold behind her, a well-deserved rest the words underneath said, and a little symbol of a location. A place Ruth had only ever seen on weather maps, a place with palm trees and turquoise water, and a name that meant the opposite of a wellness summit in the state capital. The date on the picture was a date Ruth knew, because she had stood in this kitchen on that date, wiping crayon off the table and telling Theo that yes, Daddy and Mommy would call before bed. They hadn't. She'd made the call up. They say goodnight, they love you. Because what else do you tell a crying 8-year-old? She put the phone face down on the folding table. And here is what mattered, the part Ruth wanted me to say plainly. She did not in that moment turn cold and clear and become a different woman, a planner, all the soft places in her gone hard at once. What happened to her was slower and more human and a great deal harder. She defended them. She sat in the storage room at the end of the hall and she built her son's case for him brick by brick, the way only a mother can. They worked so hard, the two of them. Maybe the trip was business, mostly, and they'd simply tacked a few days on. People did that. It wasn't a crime. It was practically responsible, getting some rest. Maybe Brooke had bought the dress, secondhand, sand and all. Maybe Ruth was a bitter, idle old woman with too much time and a head full of suspicion, turning her own children into criminals because she was lonely in a borrowed room and wanted the importance of being lied to. She took up the hem, an inch, neat, invisible, the best hem she'd sewn in a year, because she put all of it into the needle, all the doubt, all the love, all the refusal. She pressed it. She hung the mint dress on the door and went down to start dinner, and she was, to anyone watching, exactly the grandmother she had been that morning. But she did not sleep that night or the next. She lay in the dark and felt the certainty rising in her like cold water in a well, slow from somewhere underground, and she pushed it down, and it rose anyway because that is what the truth does. You can pack a suitcase over it. You cannot make it not be there. It was 3 nights later that she understood. The doubt was no longer about the trip. She was in the living room after dinner, folding the warm laundry on the couch, and the little ones were on the floor. Theo building a tower, Mia knocking it down, the two of them laughing, in that bottomless way small children laugh. And Nina was on the other sofa with a book held up in front of her face. But Ruth, glancing over, saw that the book wasn't moving. Nina's eyes weren't tracking the lines. They were fixed, over the top edge of the page, on her grandmother. The girl had been watching her for weeks. Ruth had felt it and filed it and not looked. Now she looked back. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze across the room. The old woman with her hands full of someone's clean towels, and the 16-year-old with the still book, and something passed between them that did not need words. A recognition. The way two people who've been keeping the same secret recognize each other in a crowd. Nina closed the book slowly. She set it on the cushion beside her, and in a voice pitched low, under the children's noise, so that only Ruth could hear it, she said, "Grandma, I have to show you something." Ruth's hands went still in the laundry. Out the window, the street was quiet and orderly, identical houses, identical lawns, everything ironed flat. Somewhere upstairs, the furnace clicked on and began patiently to breathe. "All right," Ruth said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Show me." She set the till down, folded in a neat, warm stack on the arm of the couch. She would think of that stack later, that absurd, tidy stack. The last ordinary thing her hands did before the floor of her life tilted and everything slid toward the truth. Then she followed her granddaughter up the stairs. Nina's room was the only room in that house with a soul. Ruth saw at the moment the door closed behind them. Everywhere else, Brooke had decorated for the camera. The living room staged in grays and golds, throw pillows arranged at angles no one was allowed to disturb, a wall of framed family photographs in which everyone was smiling and tan and nobody was real. But Nina's room was a thicket, band posters curling at the corners, clothes over the back of the chair, books stacked sideways on the desk, spines cracked, actually read, a string of dead fairy lights. It was messy the way a person is messy when they're allowed to exist, and Ruth understood, standing in it, that she had not seen anyone in this house allowed to exist until now. Nina turned the little lock on the door. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and patted the quilt beside her, and Ruth sat, and the girl took out her phone and held it in both hands without turning it on, gathering herself. "I should have told you weeks ago," Nina said. "When you first got here, I almost did at the door the first day, but you looked so happy. You looked like you finally had somewhere to be." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips flat and made herself go on. "And I'm a coward, I guess. I didn't want to be the one who took that away from you." "You're not a coward," Ruth said quietly. "You're 16. Show me." And here is where Ruth made me promise not to tidy it up, the way these things always get tidied up in the telling. Real betrayal is never organized. It doesn't come as a neat folder with the whole wicked plan spelled out in numbered steps so you can hate it cleanly. It comes in fragments, out of order, half deleted, and you have to assemble it yourself with shaking hands. And the worst part is the assembling, the way you become the detective of your own ruin. What Nina had was fragments, screenshot. A screenshot weeks old of a text she'd seen over her mother's shoulder and grabbed before the screen locked. "Brooke to Daniel, did she sign anything yet?" No context, no names, just she. But Ruth knew the way you know your own name called from across a room who she was. A photograph of a bank envelope. Nina had found it in the kitchen recycling, addressed to Ruth Calloway, at this house, an address Ruth had lived at for less than 2 months. She'd never seen the envelope. It had been opened, read, and thrown away before it ever reached her hands. Nina had photographed it and put it back because she'd been afraid to take it. A voice memo, 11 seconds, recorded by accident. Nina had meant to film Mia doing a cartwheel and caught instead her parents' voices through the kitchen wall, tinny and overlapping. Ruth made her play it 3 times. Brooke's voice, "The room's fine, she doesn't need all that space at her age." And Daniel, lower, almost bored, I know. Just let her settle. She won't ask questions, she never does. Ruth sat with that one for a while, 40 years of not asking questions. 40 years of taking the kindest possible interpretation, of building the case for the defense. He's tired, he's stressed, he didn't mean it that way. Her son had counted on that. He had looked at his mother and seen not a person but a resource, and the most useful thing about the resource was that it could be relied upon never to check. "There's more," Nina said. "But Grandma, the more I show you, the worse it is. So I need you to be okay." "I'm not going to be okay," Ruth said. "Show me anyway." So Nina showed her the last thing, and this was the one that changed the shape of everything, because it wasn't about a trip or a room or a tone of voice. It was a date. It was a screenshot of the bank's app, the joint savings account. Ruth's account, the one with the house money in it, the $312,000 that was supposed to be Ruth's, held safe. "We'll keep it for you, Mom. You shouldn't be carrying that around." Nina had seen it open on her father's laptop one night when she came down for water, and she'd photographed the screen. And there were 2 things wrong with it. The first was the balance. Ruth read it twice. The account that should have held $312,000 held $192,000. In less than 2 months, $120,000 had gone somewhere, in withdrawals labeled in that small gray type: home improvement, medical, transfer. There had been no home improvement. There had been no medical anything. There had been a beach and a mint green dress and 2 suitcases that were always packed. But it was the second thing that took the floor out from under her. It was the date the account was opened. A joint account, her name and Daniel's both on it. And the date, Ruth stared at it, and the room seemed to tilt. The date was before, 3 weeks before she'd sold her house. 4 weeks before she'd arrived with her suitcases and her casserole. The account that her son had told her, gently, reasonably, "We'll set this up once you're here, Mom." So it's all in one place. That account had already been waiting for her money. It had been built before she'd agreed to a single thing, before the phone call almost. "Mom, I need you." He had needed her. He had needed her the way you need a vein you intend to open. The rescue had been the trap. The whole warm thing, it'd be like when you were a kid, all of us under one roof, had been the wrapping on the trap, and she had walked into it carrying her own mother's thimble and a casserole so she wouldn't seem like a burden. Ruth stood up. She didn't decide to. Her body simply rose, the way it rose at 5 every morning, on its own, out of some deep refusal to lie still under what was coming. She crossed to the window. Outside, the neighborhood lay in its perfect gray order, the trees moving a little in the dark, the identical houses with their identical lit windows, families inside them doing or not doing the same quiet violence to each other. Everything looked so normal, and Ruth felt her entire life turn inside out like a sock, the dirty seams suddenly on the outside. Everything she'd thought was the truth now plainly only the lining. For 3 months, no, she caught herself. Not 3 months. She had been here barely 6 weeks. It only felt like 3 months because grief stretches time, and she understood in that moment that she had been grieving for weeks without letting herself know it. She'd been grieving her son. He was alive and downstairs, and she was already in mourning for him. Because the boy she'd nursed through pneumonia and helped through algebra and lent money to for his first car, that boy was a story she'd been telling herself. And this man with a pre-opened account and a storage room and a wife in a coral swimsuit was the truth. And the truth had been there all along, the way a hole is there under a patch. Grandma, Nina was beside her at the window now, crying without sound, the way children cry when they've learned that crying out loud gets you nothing. "I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you. I was so scared you'd leave and then it'd just be me again." And there it was. The thing Ruth hadn't let herself see, because she'd been so busy being seen herself. She turned and really looked at her granddaughter, at the careful, invisible girl who'd learned to cry without sound, who dressed herself and ate standing up and drifted ahead on the way to school so no one would have to hold her hand. "What do you mean, just you again?" So Nina told her. Not all at once, but enough. How she was the family's prop, pulled into frame for the photographs, posed, told to smile, "Nina, fix your face," and then released, set down, forgotten until the next picture. How her mother bought her clothes a size too small and called it motivation. How her father reviewed her social media and made her delete anything that didn't project the right image for the family brand. How the only reason they hadn't sent her away to boarding school was that it would look cold online, an absent teenager being harder to caption than a beautiful one. How she had been in that staged gray house, exactly what Ruth was. Useful for appearances, invisible the rest of the time, a person reduced to a function. 2 people, the same house, the same crime committed slowly, with good manners. Ruth pulled the girl into her and held her, and felt how thin she was under the oversized sweatshirt, how she shook, and something in Ruth's chest that had been frozen since the kitchen, since the sand in the hem, cracked clean down the middle. And what came through the crack was not grief, and was not even anger. It was decision. "Listen to me," she said into Nina's hair. "I am not leaving you in this house. Do you understand? Whatever I do, however I do it, I am not walking out that door without you. I will not make the mistake of saving only myself. I have spent my whole life saving only other people. I think it's time I learned to do both." Nina pulled back and looked at her, wet-faced, 16, and said the truest thing anyone had said to Ruth in years. I didn't think anybody saw me until you came. You're the only one who ever asks how my day was and actually waits for the answer. Ruth held the girl's face in both hands, the way she'd held Daniel's face when he was small and frightened of thunder, before he grew into a man who was frightened of nothing except being poor. I see you, she said, and we are going to get out, but not tonight and not in a panic, because that is how people like us lose. We're going to be careful, and we're going to be smart, and we're going to be patient. The word cost her, and we're going to do it in a way they cannot undo. Can you do that with me? Nina nodded. Then dry your face, Ruth said gently, and unlock the door, and go do your homework where they can see you. And tomorrow your grandmother is going to make some calls. She did not yet know whose. She knew only one name, an old one, a woman named Frances, who had been her best customer for 15 years and her friend for longer. Frances, who lived an hour away and had said, "Every Christmas, you call me if you ever need anything, Ruth, I mean it." She had never called. She had never needed anything. She was about to need everything, Frances cried in the coffee shop. Ruth did not. That was the first thing Ruth noticed about herself, sitting across the little table with 2 cups going cold between them, that the tears belonged to her friend now, and Ruth's own eyes had gone dry and clear and steady. The way the sky goes after the rain has already fallen. She had wept her share upstairs in Nina's room. Down here, in the smell of cinnamon and burnt espresso, she found she was finished with weeping and had moved on to the harder thing, the thing she'd been afraid of in herself her whole life, and was now grateful to find she possessed. She told Frances everything in order, laying out the pieces like a pattern before cutting: the phone call, the house, the room, the sand in the hem. The account opened before she'd agreed to anything, and Frances, 68, silver-haired, who'd buried a husband of her own and run a hardware store after, reached across and took both of Ruth's hands in her dry, warm ones and said, "You are coming to stay with me. Today, if you want, I have a room, it's yours. And if that girl needs to come, she comes too. I won't hear a word against it." "Not today," Ruth said. "If I run today with nothing, they'll spin it. They'll call it a confused old woman wandering off. They'll call it me abandoning 3 children. They'll get to the story first, and the story is the only thing they're actually good at." She turned her cup a quarter turn on its saucer, an old nervous habit lining up the handle. "I need it to be undeniable before I move. I need it on paper." Frances looked at her a long moment. "You've changed since you walked in here." "No," Ruth said. "I think I've just stopped pretending to be smaller than I am. I've been doing it so long I forgot it was a costume." It was Frances who knew what to do next, because Frances read the local paper and went to the senior center and paid attention to the world in a way Ruth, alone upstate with her needle, never had. There was a thing called an elder law clinic, she said, attached to the county. Free or near it. Lawyers who did nothing but this. Old people whose own children had decided not to wait for the will. "That's a thing?" Ruth said. "That happens enough that there's a clinic for it?" Frances's mouth went flat and sad. "Ruth, it's the most common crime nobody talks about. It just doesn't make the news because the victims are ashamed, and the thieves are family, and everybody'd rather believe it doesn't happen." The lawyer's name was Diane Okafor. She was younger than Ruth expected, maybe 45, with a quiet office and a voice that didn't rise or hurry. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, taking notes in a small, neat hand, and when Ruth finished, Diane set down her pen and said the words Ruth would carry like a coal in her pocket for the next 2 weeks. "Mrs. Calloway, what you're describing is financial elder abuse. It's a crime in this state, and from what you've told me, it's not a gray area. The screenshots are a start. But here's the part I need you to hear and not argue with." She folded her hands. "You cannot let them know that you know. Not by a word, not by a look, not by burning the dinner. If they suspect you've turned, they'll move the money where we can't reach it. They'll get their version to the children and the neighbors first, and they may try to have you declared incompetent. That's the move, when an old person starts asking questions. So until I tell you otherwise, you go home, and you are exactly the grandmother you were yesterday. You understand what I'm asking? It's the hardest thing I ask of anyone. Act normal," Ruth said. Act normal, Diane agreed, while you document everything. So that became the shape of Ruth's life, two women living in one body. By day, the helpful grandmother, the triangle sandwiches, the ironed shirts, the of course son, take your time. By night, the other one, the patient one, the one who photographed bank statements with hands that no longer shook, who saved every text without replying, who learned from Nina how to back things up to a place in the air called the cloud, where they could not be deleted by anyone whose hands she could see. Diane had been clear. Don't take anything. Don't move anything. Don't change a single thing. Photograph. Leave it exactly as you found it. You are not stealing back. You are building a record. And so, on a Tuesday when Daniel and Brooke were at what they'd called a midday investor meeting, and Ruth knew to be a long lunch somewhere with cloth napkins, she went into their bedroom for the first time, and she opened the closet, and on the top shelf behind the shoe boxes, she found the rest of it. It was the fifth box. The others held shoes. The fifth held paper. Ruth carried it to the bed and laid the pages out in the window light and read them with her reading glasses pushed up her nose. And what she found was not the beach and the dress, not the soft theft of comfort she'd already swallowed. What she found was the hard kind, the kind that goes to a courtroom. There was a credit account, a line of credit, $15,000, nearly maxed, and it was in her name. Ruth Eleanor Calloway. Her name, her old address, her social security number, and a signature at the bottom of the application that was not her signature. It was a fair forgery. A person who didn't know her hand would have passed it. But Ruth had signed receipts and order slips and her own name on thousands of garment tickets for 50 years, and she knew the architecture of her own R the way she knew her own face. This R was a stranger wearing her name. Daniel had opened debt in her name. That wasn't a son borrowing. That was a felony with her name on it. And there was worse, under it. And this was the one that made her sit down on the edge of their bed and put her hand flat against her own chest. It was a mortgage statement. For this house. The house they had welcomed her into. The house Daniel had said, "We've got the room, Mom. It'd be like when you were a kid." The house was mortgaged to the rafters and 3 payments behind. And there was a letter. She read it twice. A letter from the lender with a word in it she knew from her years of doing other people's books. Default. The house Daniel had so generously given her a room in was not solid ground. It was a boat with a hole in it, and he had invited her aboard to bail. A roof over your head. Even that had been a lie. He had not given her shelter. He had pulled her down into the water with him and called it family. Ruth photographed every page. She squared the box exactly as she'd found it, pushed it to the back of the shelf, lined the shoeboxes up front of it like soldiers, and closed the closet. Then she went downstairs and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table to wait for the people who were robbing her to come home. And when they did, loud and laughing, smelling of wine, arms full of shopping bags, she looked up and smiled the smile she had perfected over 72 years, the one that hid everything she needed it to hide, and said, "There's chicken in the oven. You hungry?" That night, after everyone slept, she sent the photographs to Diane. The reply came in minutes despite the hour. "This is more than enough. The forged credit line changes things. That's not just elder abuse. That's identity fraud, and it's documented. We can proceed whenever you're ready. But Mrs. Calloway, understand, once we file, there's no taking it back. Your son will face criminal charges. I need to know you can live with that." Ruth sat in the dark living room and looked at the wall of staged photographs, all those white teeth, and thought about a baby with nochnia she'd kept alive on 3 nights of no sleep, and typed back, "I can live with what he did. I'm done living with what I let him do to me. We proceed." It was 2 days later that Daniel made his move, right on the schedule the fragments had predicted. He came into the kitchen while she washed the dinner dishes. Nobody had come home in time to eat, took a beer from the refrigerator, leaned against the counter, and said, "Mom, I want to talk to you about something. Practical stuff, boring but important." He had a way of making theft sound like chores. "I think you should sign a power of attorney, just so I can handle the bank stuff for you if you ever, if there's ever a medical thing. You're not great with the technology. It'd make your life easier." There it was, the last brick. Have her sign the POA. Total control. Ruth set a clean plate in the rack and dried her hands slowly through the towel, buying the seconds she needed to keep her voice level, to keep the other woman folded down out of sight. A power of attorney, she repeated, as if turning the new words over. That's a big thing, son. I'd want to understand it properly before I put my name to anything. My name, she nearly smiled. You've already put my name to plenty. Let me think about it. A flicker crossed his face, irritation quickly smoothed. Sure, Mom. No rush. It's really not a big deal. It's just a piece of paper. Everything's just a piece of paper, Ruth said mildly. Until it isn't, I'll think on it. He drank beer and left the empty bottle on the counter for her to deal with, the way he always did, and went up the stairs. She heard his door close and the murmur of the television, and she stood alone in the kitchen with her damp hands and felt the absence of the thing she expected to feel. There was no pain. The pain had been used up weeks ago. What was left in its place was that steady, level certainty, and it frightened her a little, how quiet it was. The next afternoon, she called Francis. Soon, she said. He's pushing for the papers. I won't be able to hold him off long. I need somewhere to be. It's ready, Francis said. It's been ready since the coffee shop. You come when you come. And that night, Daniel announced at dinner, cheerful, oblivious, that he and Brooke were leaving Sunday. Miami this time, a 5-day industry convention. Very important, lots of contacts. You'll hold down the fort, right, Mom? It wasn't a question. He didn't wait for the answer. He never did. Ruth poured Theo more milk. Of course, son, she said. You two go. Don't worry about a thing here. Costa caught the table. Nina caught her eye for half a second and looked back down at her plate and went very still. 5 days. A locked house and the people who'd lied to her gone. And 5 days to take what was left of her life and walk out the door with it. Upstairs that night, when the house had gone quiet, Ruth opened the closet in the storage room and pulled the unfinished quilt out from under her folded sweaters. Blue and gray, a wedding ring pattern, one corner still raw and open after all these years. She spread it across the narrow bed and looked at it a long time. Then she threaded a needle, and by the light of the little lamp, she began very calmly to sew the border closed. They came back from Miami that weekend, but the dinner that broke everything open was the Sunday after. A dinner Ruth cooked herself, 4 hours of it, because Diane had said wait until they're home and settled. Don't run from an empty house, and Ruth had decided that if she had to spend one more meal at that table, she would at least spend it as herself. She didn't plan what happened. She wants that understood. She had a careful plan, and the dinner was not it, and the dinner nearly ruined the plan. But some seams, once they start to go, you cannot hold with your hands. It was a good dinner. Roast chicken, the potatoes the children liked, a flan, because it was the only dessert Nina ever asked for twice. Daniel was expansive, tanned, telling a story about a deal that had almost closed in Miami, the kind of story that was all momentum and no detail. Brooke was on her phone under the table edge. The little ones were loud and happy. Nina ate in silence and kept her eyes on her plate. And then Daniel, reaching for the potatoes, said the thing. He said it lightly. That was what Ruth could never get over afterward, not the cruelty, but the lightness, the way it cost him nothing. Brooke had made some small complaint about the upcoming travel schedule, who's even going to be here in March, and Daniel had glanced at his mother the way you glance at the thermostat and said, Mom's here. That's the whole point of Mom being here, babe. She watches the kids. We get to actually have a life. That's the deal. He took the potatoes. He was still half smiling. If she's got a problem with the arrangement, the door's right there. But she doesn't, right, Mom? The table went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a glass tips and hasn't yet hit the floor. Brooke's fork stopped. Theo and Mia looked up, sensing the change in the air the way small animals do, not understanding it. And Nina lifted her head and looked at her grandmother across the table, and her dark eyes were not afraid. They were waiting. Ruth set down her own fork. She did it gently, with no clatter. She folded her cloth napkin into a neat rectangle. 50 years of pressing other people's linen, her hands knew exactly how, and laid it beside her untouched plate. You're right, she said. Her voice came out level and almost warm, which was somehow worse than shouting. That is the deal. I've just realized I'd like to renegotiate it. Daniel's smile flickered. Mom, the door is right there. You're correct about that, too. She stood up slowly with the particular dignity her own mother had taught her. A girl standing up straight in country kitchens 60 years gone. I think I'll use it. And while you decide who watches your children in March, you might also decide who's going to pay your mortgage, since you're 3 months behind on it, and who's going to answer for the credit line you opened in my name. Since I never signed it, whatever the signature says. The flan sat in the middle of the table, untouched, gleaming. Brooke's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Daniel set down the potatoes very carefully, as if they'd become heavy, and Ruth watched something move behind his eyes. Calculation, the rapid math of a man working out how much she knew and how much it would cost him. And under the calculation, for just a second, something else. Something that looked, before he buried it, almost like a boy who knew he'd been caught. It's not, he started. Mom, you don't understand the whole. I understand all of it, Ruth said. That's the trouble. I understand it down to the seam. She turned to the little ones, and her face changed entirely, all the steel going out of it, and she touched Theo's hair and then Mia's. Finish your dinner, sweethearts. Grandma loves you. Don't you ever forget that, no matter what anybody tells you. You hear me? Then she walked out of the dining room without looking back. Behind her, she heard Daniel's chair scrape the floor and his voice, Mom, wait, it's not a big deal, and it sounded distant, the way a voice sounds from the bottom of a well, and she did not stop. She went up to the storage room at the end of the hall, and she closed the door, and she stood in the dark with her hand over her own galloping heart and thought, well, so much for waiting until the right moment. She had moved too soon. She knew it instantly. She had let them know that she knew, the exact thing Diane had warned her, twice, never to do. She took out her phone with steady fingers and texted 3 words to the lawyer. They know now. The reply came fast. Then we move tomorrow. Are you safe tonight? Yes, Ruth wrote. They don't know how much I have. They don't know it's already filed somewhere they can't reach. She thought a moment, then added, and they have 3 children to put to bed. They won't make a scene with the little ones awake. She was right about that. The house below her went very quiet, and then she heard low, urgent voices through the floor. Brooke's pitch climbing, Daniel staying flat, the 2 of them in the kitchen trying to decide how frightened to be. They didn't come up. Around 11, she heard them go to their room and shut the door, and the murmur went on a long time. Ruth lay in the narrow bed, fully dressed. On top of the quilt she'd finished sewing the border on, and did not sleep and was not afraid. In the morning, she did the impossible thing. She acted normal. She made the lunches, triangles, fruit, a cat and Mia's. She woke the children. She walked the younger 2 to school with Theo's hand in her right and Mia's in her left, 4 blocks the last time, though only she knew it. Nina walked beside her instead of ahead, close. And when they reached the school gate, Nina hugged her hard and whispered, Is it today? And Ruth said, It's today. Come straight home after. Bring only your ID, your laptop, and whatever you can't replace. We can buy the rest. And Nina nodded and went in, and Ruth walked back to the house alone, and Daniel and Brooke were gone, to a lawyer of their own, she'd learn later, scrambling. And the empty house was hers for the few hours she needed it to be. She called Francis. Today, we'll be there by 5. The room's made up, Francis said. Drive careful. Don't speed, don't run any lights, give them nothing. A pause. Ruth, I'm proud of you. I don't know if anyone said that. No one had. Ruth had to stand very still in the kitchen for a moment before she could answer. Thank you, she said. Then she called Diane, and Diane said the plan was in motion, the documents ready to be served the moment Ruth confirmed she was out of the house. A protective order, a civil suit to recover the money, and a fraud report already in the hands of the right people. But listen to me about the girl, Diane said, and her voice sharpened. This is where people make a mistake that wrecks everything. You do not get to just take a 16-year-old out of her parents' house. That's not how it works, no matter how right you are. If you grab her and run, you become the kidnapper in the story, and they'll use it and they'll win. Ruth's heart dropped. Then I leave her. I promised her I wouldn't. You don't leave her and you don't kidnap her. You do it the slow legal way that actually holds. Diane's voice gentled. She's old enough that the court will hear her preference. We file for temporary guardianship and we let her stay with you while it's pending. But it has to be documented, voluntary, and on the record. I've already drafted it. She comes with you today, yes. But she comes with a paper trail showing it was her informed choice and that you're seeking proper guardianship, not absconding with a child. There's a difference between rescuing someone and stealing them, and the difference is the paperwork. Do it my way and they can't touch you. Do it the movie way and you'll lose her for real. So they did it Diane's way. Nina came home from school at 3:30 with her small backpack and signed at the kitchen table a statement in her own 16-year-old hand saying who she wished to live with and why, while Ruth's phone recorded the date and Diane's office stood by to file before morning. It was not dramatic. It was a girl signing a piece of paper. But it was the difference, Ruth understood, between a story that ended in a courtroom on her side and one that ended with Nina sent back and Ruth in a cell. At 3:45, they carried the bags out the back door, through the kitchen, around the side of the house to the street where Ruth's old car sat. The car Daniel had told her to sell. You don't need it anymore, Mom. The car she'd quietly kept registered and insured the whole time, because some part of her, the part that read the truth in a hymn, had never fully believed she was staying. She put the 2 suitcases and the 3 boxes in the trunk. The quilt went on top, folded, finished. Nina got in the passenger seat with her backpack on her knees. Before she started the engine, Ruth took a white envelope from her purse. She'd written the letter the night before, by the lamp, choose each word the way she chose thread for a color. She read it one last time. Daniel, by the time you read this, I'm gone. I will not be your unpaid help any longer. I will not sign your power of attorney. I will not let you keep stealing from me. My lawyer will contact you about the money and about the credit you opened in my name, which is a crime whether you understand that yet or not. The children are with you, where they belong, because they are your responsibility, not mine, and never mine to lose. Nina is with me because she chose to come, in her own hand on the record. Do not look for us. Do not call. The bank you've been hiding from will be the least of what finds you if you do. Your mother. She got out of the car, walked back to the front door, and slid the envelope underneath it. She watched the white edge of it disappear into the house. Then she walked back to the car, started the engine, and drove to the corner and turned and did not look in the mirror, not because she was afraid of what she'd see behind her, but because there was nothing behind her she needed anymore. Nina was silent in the passenger seat, gripping her backpack like it might float away. Ruth reached over and put a hand on the girl's knee. It's all right to be scared, she said. I'm scared too. We're going to be scared together, and we're going to be all right anyway. Both things can be true. The drive to Francis's took 40 minutes. Every red light felt an hour long. Ruth kept her eyes on the road and her hands at 10 and 2, and gave the world no reason to stop her. And the street behind them stayed empty, and somewhere back in that staged gray house, an envelope was lying on the floor inside the door, waiting, white as a folded napkin, with everything in it. The phone started ringing before they'd reached the highway. Daniel. Ruth glanced at the screen, then back at the road and let it ring out. It started again and again. She did not answer. There was nothing left in her to say to him that hadn't already been said over a flan that no one ever ate. Francis was waiting on her porch when they pulled in. Peach-colored walls, a flower bed, a big tree out front. She came down the steps before they'd even stopped the car, and she opened Nina's door, and she gathered the girl into her arms like she'd known her all her life. Then she looked over Nina's shoulder at Ruth, who was lifting the finished quilt out of the trunk, and she said the 4 words Ruth hadn't heard from anyone since Sam died. You're safe here. Welcome. The papers were served that evening, while Ruth and Nina were eating Francis's vegetable soup at a small kitchen table with floral placemats and cloth napkins, and no suitcases anywhere by the door. A man in a windbreaker rang the bell. Francis answered, spoke low, came back. Process server for you. Ruth signed where he pointed, and he handed her a thick envelope and was gone. Inside were the copies of everything Diane had filed, the protective order, the civil suit to recover what had been taken, The fraud report now sitting on a prosecutor's desk, and the guardianship petition with Nina's own signed statement attached. By now, Diane said when she called, Daniel had been served his own copy. As of this hour, he could not touch the savings account. What was left of Ruth's money, the $192,000, frozen mid-bleed, was protected. He'll try to reach you, Diane said. Don't answer. Everything goes through me now. The calls came anyway, 10 in the first hour. Ruth read the texts on the lock screen without opening them, watching the famous cycle exactly as Diane had described it. The way you can watch a storm come in across flat country and name each part before it arrives. First, the apologies. Mom, I'm sorry. We can fix this. Please call. Then, when those got no answer, the threats. You can't just take Nina. That's kidnapping. You'll regret this. Then the blame. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? Then, circling back, the guilt, aimed with a marksman's care. Theo cried himself to sleep, asking where you went. She saved everyone. They were evidence. They were also, she understood, the whole pattern of her life with him laid out at last in plain text, the things she'd spent 40 years declining to read. That night, sharing the guest room's double bed in the dark, Nina told her things she'd never told anyone. The clothes a size too small, the deleted posts, the feeling of being furniture that smiled on command, and the worst of it, which came out quietest. How she'd stopped believing anyone would ever look at her and see a person, until an old woman with a needle moved into the storage room and asked, on the very first morning, "How did you sleep, sweetheart?" and waited for the answer. They both cried, and then they both slept, and in the morning, the world was still there, and so were they. Brooke came on the third day. Ruth never learned how she got the address. Followed Nina, probably, or paid someone. Frances called her in the garden, where Ruth had taken her coffee, and said, "That woman is on my porch. She says she won't leave till she's talked to you." "What do I do?" "Don't open the door," Ruth said, already moving. "I'm coming." Brooke was sitting on the porch steps when Ruth arrived, and she looked nothing like her photographs. No makeup, hair scraped back, gray sweatpants, a person with the brand switched off. She stood when she saw Ruth. "5 minutes," Brooke said. "Out here. Daniel doesn't know I came. I swear it." Ruth stopped at the bottom of the steps, the width of the walk between them. Talk. And Brooke talked. And this is where the last thing turned over. The thing Ruth had not seen coming, because she'd spent 2 months building the case against her son and had let herself believe she finally had the whole of it. "It was me," Brooke said. "The plan, bringing you in, the account, the room, I built it, not Daniel. Daniel told me there was money in your house, and I'm the one who said, then get her to give it to us." Her voice was flat, exhausted, past performing. "He has debts you don't even know the size of. The company went under 18 months ago. There is no company. The trips were the only thing keeping us looking like we were still those people online. I needed the pictures to be true for 1 more week. Every week. Forever." She laughed, an awful small sound. "I used you. I used Nina. And I was good at it because I told myself it was temporary, that we'd pay you back, that nobody was really getting hurt." Ruth said nothing. She was looking at this young woman she'd been ready to hate cleanly, and finding the hatred had nowhere flat to land. "But here's why I came." Brooke pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "When you walked out at dinner, that night after, Daniel didn't yell. I wanted him to. I needed him to be angry so I could be angry. He just sat on the bathroom floor. And he said," her voice went thin. "He said, I think I stopped being a person a while ago and I didn't notice when. He said he'd written you a letter months back, before any of it, when it was still just an idea, to tell you not to come, to warn you off us. And he deleted it." She looked up. He knew Ruth. Some part of him always knew exactly what he was, and he did it anyway. And that's worse, isn't it? That's so much worse than not knowing. It was. Ruth felt the weight of it settle. Not absolution, there was none here for either of them. But the flat, clean villain she'd needed in order to do this had just become two frightened people who had chosen, with full knowledge, to do an unforgivable thing to her. And the choosing with knowledge did not make them less guilty, it made them more. And it made her decision, when it came, heavier than revenge could ever have been. "He's looking at prison," Brooke said. "The fraud, the forgery, the elder abuse. Daniel's lawyer says years. The children growing up visiting their father through glass. Please. She was crying now, openly. Drop the criminal side. We'll give back what's left. We'll sign anything. Just don't destroy your own son. I'm not destroying him, Ruth said quietly. He destroyed himself with a signature that wasn't mine. I'm only refusing to be destroyed with him. There's a difference, and it took me 72 years to learn it, and I am not unlearning it on your porch. She paused. But I'll think about the rest. Go home, Brooke. Go home to those children and be better than you've been, because that's the only thing left that you can still fix. Brooke went, and Ruth sat down on the steps where she'd been sitting and stayed there until the coffee in her hand went cold, thinking about a man on a bathroom floor who'd known all along, and a letter he'd written and deleted, and whether knowing the worst about your own child is a thing you can ever set down. The deal was signed 8 days later in Diane's office, with Frances beside Ruth for ballast. Diane had built it the way Ruth would have built a strong seam, every stress point reinforced. Daniel and Brooke acknowledged, in writing, taking Ruth's money under false pretenses. They agreed to return what remained and to surrender the proceeds of a forged credit line. They acknowledged, in writing, the identity fraud. That document alone, Diane noted dryly, would keep them very polite for a long time. They agreed to no contact, direct or indirect, and the term Ruth had refused to sign without. They consented formally, on the record, to Ruth's guardianship of Nina, making legal and permanent the thing they'd called kidnapping, closing the last open seam so it could never be pulled at again. In exchange, Ruth withdrew the criminal complaint while keeping the civil suit alive as a tripwire. Violate any term, and the whole thing came back. She chose mercy. But she chose it the way she did everything now, with the stitching reinforced, so that mercy could not be mistaken for weakness and could not be undone. Daniel was there. He wouldn't meet her eyes through the signing. At the door leaving, he stopped and turned, and for the first time looked at her directly. Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know where it went wrong. I love you. I always did. Ruth looked at her son, at her own brown eyes set in his tired face. I believe that you think you do, she said, without cruelty. But love that takes and calls it family isn't love, Daniel. It's just the word you reach for when you need something. I hope you learn the difference before your children have to teach it to you the way I just did. She let that sit. Take care of them. That's the only thing I'll ever ask you again. He opened his mouth and nothing came and he left. That was the last time she saw him. The months after were quiet, and the quiet, which had terrified her at first, slowly became the best thing she owned. She didn't stay at Frances's forever. With the recovered money, most of it back, in the end, she took a small 2-bedroom in a senior building 2 miles away. East-facing kitchen window, a narrow balcony, 1 room for her and 1 for Nina. In the corner of the living room, she set up a folding table and the old machine, and word got around the building the way it always had. There's a woman on the 3rd floor who can fix anything. Hems, zippers, a wedding dress let out for a granddaughter, a soldier's uniform taken in. She charged little and turned no one away, and earned again money that was hers, made with her own hands that no one could open an account against. Nina bloomed the way a thing blooms when you finally stop standing on it. Her grades climbed. She made friends who came over and made noise. In the spring, her school held an art show, and she exhibited a series of paintings she called The Women in the Background. Women working at the edges of frames while other people shone in the center. One of them was an old woman at a sewing machine, half transparent, the light passing through her. When Ruth asked gently why she'd painted her that way, Nina said, "Because that's how they made you, see-through. But you're not anymore, Grandma. Now everybody sees you." And Ruth had to go stand by the punch table for a minute. Theo called once, months in, from a number Ruth didn't know. Found her in his father's old phone, whispered fast, "Grandma, I miss you. Daddy says you left because you didn't love us, but I don't believe him." And Ruth told him the truest thing she could fit in a child's hands, that she loved him to the bottom of the world, that sometimes the people we love hurt us in ways too big to explain yet, and that walking away from being hurt is not the same as not loving. When you're grown, she told him, and you can choose for yourself, my door is open. It will always be open. The call lasted 10 minutes. She held the phone to her chest for an hour after. She turned 73 that October. Francis and Nina made a lopsided cake and sang off key, and Nina gave her a blank journal with a note on the first page. So you can write your story. The real one. The one nobody can take. That night, alone, Ruth opened it and didn't know where to start, and then began at the end where Chichichi was. Today I am 73, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I belong to myself. The finished quilt hung over the back of her chair, blue and gray, the wedding ring pattern, the border she'd sewn shut by lamplight in a storage room the last night she ever spent in that house. Sometimes, reading in the evening, she'd reach back without looking and run her thumb along that border seam, the place that had been raw and open for years, that she'd finally closed under the worst pressure of her life. It held. It was, if anything, tighter than the rest. That was the thing about a tear mended right. It doesn't go back to how it was before. It comes back stronger, exactly where it broke. She never went back to the house where she'd been invisible. She never again answered when they called to need something. She closed that door gently and firmly, and on the other side of it, she built a small life that was entirely her own. And she stopped, after 50 years, making herself smaller to fit the spaces other people had cut for her. It was enough. It was, she'd tell me at the end of her letter, more than enough. It was everything. Ruth asked me to keep her endings. Ruth asked me to keep her ending simple, so I will. She got her name back. She got the girl out the right way, the lawful way, the way that holds. And she got the one thing nobody could open an account against, a life that's hers. She wanted you to hear this, and only this. Walking away from people who love you badly is not the same as failing to love them. Sometimes it's the last loving thing you have left, for them, and for the person you're finally free to be. So if tonight you've been made to feel like furniture in your own family, take up a little more room, starting now. Thank you, Ruth. Take care of yourselves out there. I'll see you soon.